Hello. On behalf of the Center for Ethics and Human Values and all of our partners, I'd like to welcome you to today's event on what is the American dream. This is one of those events where the only person who needs an introduction is the person giving the introductions. So my name is Piers Turner. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values and a professor in the philosophy department here at OSU. So each year our center has a COMPAS program that hosts a year-long series of events focused on a major social challenge. And it brings together researchers from a variety of disciplines and works to promote informed and respectful discourse. This year we're focusing on the question, what is America? And as I say that, I hear jazz in the background, which is a very American thing, but if you, oh good, we're good. So what is America is our year-long series. And this is a fraught topic, obviously, in our polarized political circumstances. And our guiding question has been whether there are any values we share as Americans and how those might help us build a better future together. One of the most resonant phrases in American public discourse is the American dream. Politicians, community leaders, and regular citizens alike use that phrase to capture something of the promise of our country, often connected to social mobility, economic opportunity, and its relationship to hard work. The phrase itself first appeared during the Great Depression, and historically the idea took shape during the post-World War II economic expansion. Polls show that Americans today remain remarkably optimistic about the American dream. While most people do not yet claim to have achieved the American dream, and there are large differences, for instance, in the answers of white and black Americans on that question, large majorities of Americans across groups believe they are on the way to achieving the American dream. It clearly has a powerful hold on the public imagination, even at a time when, for instance, social mobility in the US is declining or lagging behind some other developed countries, and economic inequality has reached historic levels. Today, we're lucky to have 4 distinguished participants help us understand the promise of the American dream and what steps we might take to help make the dream a reality for all Americans. We're going to begin with brief remarks from J.D. Vance, an Ohio native and Ohio State graduate who's best known as the author of the influential memoir Hillbilly Elegy, a New York Times #1 bestseller, now being developed into a movie by Netflix with director Ron Howard at the helm and some big-name actors. Vance is also a graduate of Yale Law School and now resides back in Ohio, where he's founded a nonprofit called Our Ohio Renewal. After his remarks, we will also have brief remarks from Darrick Hamilton, executive director of our Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and professor in the Glenn College of Public Affairs. Professor Hamilton is a pioneer in the field of stratification economics. His TED Talk proposing what are called baby bonds to address wealth inequality now has over 1.5 million views on YouTube. And he's also been a consultant with a number of political campaigns. Vance and Hamilton will then join Dean Gretchen Ritter for a moderated discussion and Q&A. Ritter, I said they didn't need introductions, but I'm doing it anyway. Ritter is Ohio State's Executive Dean of Arts and Sciences, Professor of Political Science, and a leading scholar on women's rights and citizenship, whose most recent book is The Constitution as Social Design, Gender and Civic Membership in the American Constitutional Order. At the conclusion of the first session, we'll take a 15-minute coffee break and then return for a talk by the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist David Leonhardt. Leonhardt was also the founder of the Upshot section at the Times, and he's also a former Washington bureau chief. His talk will be entitled Reviving the American Dream. Now, before I invite J.D. Vance to get us started, I want to take a moment to thank our partners on this event, the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, the Honors and Scholars Center, and the Minorities in Philosophy organization. We really rely on our wonderful partners to have these kinds of events, and we're just grateful for not just their financial support, but also their moral support. I also want to thank our organizing team, Eric McGilvray, who's down here in the front, is professor of political science and our center's COMPAS coordinator. He's really led the way on this year's program. Kate McFarland, our associate director, has overseen all the planning, and Avery White, our center associate, and Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer, our graduate associate, have been vital members of the team making it all happen. So finally, thank you for coming out today for this event. It's brainy out there. And if you would, please join me in welcoming J.D. Vance to the stage.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks especially to the folks at Ohio State, Kate, Avery, Gretchen, Eric, Pierce for making this happen and for letting me be part of it, especially to Darrick for participating. And I'll try to set the stage and just give some insight into my own thinking on these questions. But before I did that, I wanted to sort of do two things. First, it may sound like a little cheesy, but it's always really wonderful to be back at Ohio State. A lot of the things that I'm thinking about to this day, a lot of things that I'm writing about, a lot of the things that I have written about, I first started thinking about in Eric McGilvray's political theory classes when I was an undergraduate. So I owe a lot to this university, and especially to his teaching. And I hope at least you're not embarrassed by what I'm about to say. The second sort of introductory remark that I wanted to say is that I always think it's useful to put your cards on the table. We live in this sort of hyper-ideological moment, and while a lot of us like to pretend that we don't have particular biases that we bring to the table, I think I like to acknowledge that I do and actually let the audience know where I'm coming from so, you can get some sense of what I'm saying, of why I'm saying it. I am, I guess, theoretically here to present the conservative perspective, and I certainly consider myself a conservative and sit on the right side of the American political spectrum, but I do think that we're in such a weird moment in American politics and American life that it's actually worth talking about what that actually means. I actually received, when I was sitting down, an email from an academic who writes on labor and immigration. I'm a very big fan of her work. And I'd never reached out to her, I'd never talked to her, but she saw something that I did recently and decided to send me a very nice email. And she described me in this email as a conservative laborist. And I don't necessarily know what that means, but I think what it means is that within the American right these days, there are sort of two big strains of thought. One I will call libertarian, though I know that's a bit of a generalization. It is very focused on questions of economic growth, very focused on the idea that the market, especially the freest market possible, is the creator of prosperity. And then it's going to be a little bit more individualist in its ethics, a little bit more passive in its approach to cultural regulation and so forth. And then there's a group that you might call communitarian, and that's sort of where I fit on this conversation. And what's so weird about American politics these days is that very often the communitarians find themselves in weird areas of disagreement with what might be called the far left on certain economic questions. And I think that that's useful to set that stage, because while I wouldn't say that I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders in the 2020 election, I do think that there are a lot of critiques that left populists make of the country that are valid and are at least attacking some of the right issues. So for example, relevant to a lot of the folks in this room, I tend to think that the question of college debt and the question of whether folks like you can actually afford to go to school, but more importantly, whether you can afford to build a life after you've left school, are important questions. The answer cannot simply be, you chose to go to college, you chose to assume the debt, and that's all there is to say about it. So I think we have to be sort of more cognizant of a lot of these economic questions in formulating our view, our vision of the common good. And I have my own particular vision of that as a conservative, as a person of faith, but that's sort of where I'm coming. So with that, let me say just a couple things. And third introductory thing, I'm going to make sure I'm on time. I get until about 2:40 or so, and then I should shut up? Okay. So this question of the American dream is very rhetorically powerful. It's something that a lot of us think and talk about. It gives us a sort of thing to shoot towards when we're formulating public policy and thinking about what type of a society that we want to live in. But it's, of course, a very fraught term. It's a term that if you ask 100 different people, you might get 100 different definitions. A definition that's very common among economics folks, among social scientists, is this idea of relative or absolute upward mobility, that you're either moving through the socioeconomic ladder in some way, or perhaps that you're just earning more than the generation that came before it. That first term is relative mobility, the last is absolute mobility. I think that absolute mobility is a decent way of measuring in economics terms this idea of the American dream. I think most parents, and this is certainly true of me, when they look to the future, when they look at their own children, they want those kids to have a little bit better of a life than they did. And while that's not, I would say, primarily an economic question, it's at least partially an economic question, especially if you don't have a lot of money. So when my grandparents, who grew up in very extreme poverty, thought about their own children's lives, at least part of living a better life was knowing that your kids would have a little bit more financial stability, a little bit more comfort, and a little bit more money than they had. That was a very important way in which we talked and thought about the American dream. However, I do think that the monetary, the economic, the material sense in which we measure the economic dream, while useful, has gotten a little bit out of control in our current society. And I think this is especially true for the people in this room. I imagine that most of the people here are either students at Ohio State in some form or another, or affiliated with the university. And in a very important way, we are the winners in the American meritocracy. We're the people who either have or will acquire the credentials that allow us to gain a little bit more financial comfort than other people, to gain a little bit more social stature than other people. You don't quite realize how powerful a college degree is until you talk to somebody who's ashamed that they don't have a degree. And unfortunately, a lot of people do feel like that. And so despite the problems with debt and so forth, I think there are real problems. The unfortunate in some ways, but unavoidable fact is that we are the people who are perceived, and I think usually rightly so, as winning in the modern American system. That's an important thing, because I think it gives us a certain division from the rest of the people that we share the society with. And one of the good things about how I grew up, I come from a background where nobody really had a college education in my family, is that I never quite could get what I call the striver way of defining the American dream. There's this sense that the American dream is earning a lot of money, it's gaining a prestigious credential, it's getting a very fancy job, it's doing things that give you a certain amount of social stature and social privilege. But to me, the American dream is always a little bit more simple. It was always a little bit more humble. There are a few things that I wanted out of the American dream, and I think it's useful to categorize them by the phase of life. I tend to break life up into three phases. I'm sort of in its middle phase now, where I have a young family of my own. I think in the first phase, the American dream meant to me living in a stable, comfortable home, being around people who loved each other, who didn't fight all the time, who weren't abusing drugs, knowing that food was going to be on the table each and every night, knowing where you were going to lay your head at the end of every night. It was a very basic sense of stability and comfort. And frankly, it didn't require relative mobility to achieve that American dream. It didn't require that I go to an Ivy League law school. It didn't require that I have a prestigious profession. Now, at the mid-phase of life, the way that I thought about what I wanted out of my life is, I'm very happy to say, basically where I am right now. I wanted to have a family. I wanted to have a wife who I could care for in the way that so often husbands weren't able to care for, and who could care for me in turn, and so often the way that I didn't see a whole lot of wives caring for husbands. I wanted to provide my own kids with this type of stability and comfort that I didn't have when I was a kid. That was my American dream. I want my kids to be happy. I want them to know where they're going to sleep at night. I want them to know that I'll always be around. I want them to know that their mother will always be around. That's really all I wanted. Again, doesn't require a whole lot of relative mobility, doesn't require a lot of fancy education. Pretty simple. And if I can be a little provocative, when I thought about the end stage of my life, I thought about having grandchildren. I thought about having regular visits with the people and friends and family that I loved. I thought about reading a lot, reflecting on life. I think an important part of being an elderly person in our society is passing wisdom onto the generations who come after you. And in a very important sense, I think that this notion of the American dream is in crisis at all three phases. And let me just walk through why I think that is, but also first describe it. So in the first phase, that childhood phase, we know that children are much more likely to experience depression, anxiety. That's true up and down the income ladder. We know especially that working and even middle-class children are increasingly likely to experience family breakdown, dissolution, childhood trauma. In our home state, they're much more likely to grow up in homes that suffer from serious addiction problems. In other words, we are currently in arguably the most chaotic generation of childhood that we've seen in our country. So I think in that sense, the American dream is very much in crisis. In this middle phase of life, again, the way that I thought of the American dream, it's very much in crisis. You have rising rates of family dissolution. You have people who can't acquire the jobs that are necessary to provide for that family. When they have work, it's very often not especially meaningful or not especially well paid. And so this idea that you would have a stable job and be able to provide for a family, I think that too, even in what is frankly an economic boom, is more in crisis than it has been in a very long time. And then finally, at this end stage of life, which is something that I worry a lot about because, of course, all of us are going to get there eventually, we live in a society where increasingly elderly people are living alone, where they don't have children and family around, in part because our fertility rate is so low that there aren't a whole lot of children and family around in the lives of the elderly. We know where this trajectory is taking us, and it's taking us to something like modern Japan. Again, I'm going to be particularly and intentionally provocative here, and I hope you'll forgive me if I overstep. But we now have a phenomenon in certain countries in East Asia, increasingly in Western Europe, where people are dying with such little care and comfort around them that they're going unnoticed and unrecognized for weeks or even months after they pass. I think about my great-grandmother, grew up in extreme poverty, my grandmother who grew up in extreme poverty. When they died, they were surrounded by over a dozen people who loved them. We were singing church hymns. We were reading the Bible. That way of finishing your life, of feeling like you're part of a family unit, of feeling like you're passing something on to the generation that comes after you is increasingly disappearing. So again, in all three phases of life, we're experiencing an American dream that is lonelier, that is less fulfilling in our family lives, that is less capable of providing the basic things that we all need that are not necessarily easy to measure with money. Now, the financial piece of this is, of course, important because a lot of the things that are necessary to provide this sort of familial or communitarian sense of the American dream are harder to provide when you don't have money, of course. And so there are a few things that I think are going on, and I'm going to categorize them in sort of two big categories. I want to focus on two things, and I think, at least in my current thinking, this is where the American dream is most substantially going awry. So, or I should say, this is what's causing the American dream to go substantially awry. So the first is, I'm going to get back to the economics a little bit. The first is, I think, primarily an economic phenomenon. And it's about productivity, it's about the labor market, it's about what we're doing in the broad American economy. Specifically, we tend to think, and I think we still have this weird inability to look at the world around us and see it for what it is, we tend to think that we're living in an especially high growth or dynamic world. We have these iPhones, they could do things that no computer could do even 30 years ago. We have new programs, we have artificial intelligence, big data, all of these buzzwords about how much better and more technologically progressive our society is getting. But in important ways, we're actually not progressing technologically as fast as we used to. My mentor and friend Peter Thiel famously says that in the 1960s, we were promised flying cars. Instead, we got 140 characters. I guess Twitter has now updated it. It has 280 characters, so that's real progress compared to flying cars. We're not any closer to flying cars than we were 50 years ago. If you were to take a flight today from New York to Paris, it would take you longer to fly there than it did in the 1970s. We have no commercially available hypersonic aircraft. Think about energy. We, of course, have a climate problem in our society, one largely caused now by unrestrained emissions in China. Part of the reason we have that problem is because we're not generating energy much cleaner than we used to 30 or 40 years ago. In fact, the biggest improvement in emissions is solar energy, which can provide a substantial amount of our power, but can't provide anything like 50% of our power, definitely not 100% of our power. And through sort of our increasing reliance on natural gas, which of course is an improvement over dirtier forms of power, but isn't exactly the sort of thing that's going to take us to a clean energy future. Along a lot of these dimensions, healthcare, everybody's living longer, right? Well, that's true if you account the amount of years that they're passing. Doesn't really hold if you count the amount of quality adjusted years that they're living. We're not any better at treating dementia or various neurodegenerative conditions than we were 30 or 40 years ago. We're no closer to even understanding how Alzheimer's works, much less curing it. And so on the one hand, we have the phantom of dynamism, the feeling that things are growing rapidly, when really we have a lot of improvement in this thing, but not much improvement in what I call the world of atoms, the world that most of us actually live in most of the time. And importantly, though there's been a lot of progress in this thing, we're starting to realize that maybe that progress isn't as significant or as good as we might have thought it was. We're realizing that there's a pretty powerful connection between the amount of time that we stare on our phones and how little we talk to our family. We're realizing that a lot of the app makers who benefit from every second that we stare at these phones care a lot more about keeping us focused on those phones instead of participating in the broader social world around us. We know that the suicide rate, especially among teenage girls, is rising just as the amount of time that they spend on their mobile devices is rising. We're learning about all of these really disgusting online communities that bully, that traffic in sexual victims. These things, frankly, are not what a lot of people were promised when they were promised technological progress in the 1960s. They were promised 100-year lifespans, clean energy, rapid transportation, and instead they're finding out that the biggest thing that we've technologically progressed on may in fact be making us more mentally sick than we would like to admit. That's one thing. An economy that in important ways is stagnating in a very real sense. And the second thing that's happening is that our institutions are fraying. So it would be one thing if our economy was stagnating even as our institutions were incredibly dynamic, powerful, stable. But they're not. If you look at the institutions that working class Americans especially have always depended on, you're going to look at three things. The first is their local political shop, their local political participation function, whether it's a guild, whether it's Tammany Hall, whatever the case may be. People have always felt, even at the lower rungs of society, I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people have always felt that they had representative democracy and access to it. That's sort of disappeared. We now have a hyper-nationalized politics. To the extent that we have successful democratic politics at all, we're electing congressmen, senators. I don't know what they actually do. It's sort of oddly late Roman Republic. They just complain and talk all the time. They don't actually legislate. So two of the most significant pieces of federal conduct in the past 10 years were Barack Obama's immigration change in DACA and, were Barack Obama's immigration change in DACA and Donald Trump's, I'm blanking on the big administrative action of Donald Trump. Reversing that immigration action. So we're primarily, we had health care, that was Obamacare. That was now over 10 years ago, I believe, or maybe just now 10 years ago. We had tax cuts, which frankly President Trump probably could have done through changing IRS regulations without a whole lot of complaint. We live in a world where the basic machinations of democratic government don't actually work that well anymore. The second big institution that working class Americans always relied on, the first was in politics, the second was in the economy, was the labor union. In the late 1950s, we had 35% private participation in labor unions. That doesn't count public participation in labor unions, fire, police, teachers, and so forth. Those were the institutions that gave working class Americans real bargaining power in the American economy. I think the private sector labor participation rate is now around 5%. So they've completely disappeared in an important way. And then the final one is the church. That was the way that working class Americans had real say in the culture. We don't realize this now, but there was a point in American history where Hollywood scriptwriters would actually seek approval for scripts through working class institutions like the church, lest they didn't produce anything that would be so unacceptable to the broad population that it wouldn't make any money. Now, of course, working class participation in churches, in bowling leagues, and a whole host of community institutions has fallen off a cliff. and we don't, in any real sense, give working class Americans any real participation in the cultural making of our country. That, to me, is primarily a story of globalization, meaning these declining institutions have declined, I think, because you've combined relatively stagnant economic progress on the one hand with rapid globalization on the other hand. Let's just take one example. One of the reasons we don't have, in my view, the same sort of technological progress that we used to is because we have American firms, American corporations increasingly invested not in technological development, but in labor arbitrage. In the 1950s, if you as an American company wanted to make more money, you needed to invest in things that made your workers more productive. That was typically technology. In the 1990s, if you wanted to do something that was going to make your company more money, you would just undercut the cost of labor by either shipping a job to China or some other place, or by having somebody in the country willing to do that job at a lower wage than another American. So you have this combination of a labor arbitrage built into our economy, built primarily around globalization, that has led not to workers increasing their productivity, increasing their wages, but has led instead to a decimation of the American working and middle class. And of course, if you look at the evidence, the primary driver of the decline of private sector unions is not right-to-work laws. I'm not a big fan of right-to-work laws, but the big problems in American labor happened before it. They happened primarily because the jobs that people unionized into no longer exist in this country. From 1999 to 2006, we lost 7 million manufacturing jobs just to China alone. That's where a lot of the union jobs went. I could go on and on, I could give more examples, but that's my sense of what's happening, is the institutions that gave working class Americans a sense of stability, of comfort, of participation in their society have frayed at the very time that the economy productivity gains have stagnated in a very important sense. I think that our society could survive on one or the other of them. I don't think that it can survive on both. And let me just give a couple of reasons why. I think in a very important sense, American government has never experimented with what you do in a world where the institutions are broken down and there isn't any productivity. But American constitutional government is fundamentally a story of one side being able to give something to its constituents, another side being able to give something to its constituents. But if you have very low growth and you have very weak community institutions, then Democrats can't give anything to their constituents without taking something away from Republican constituents and vice versa. It gives our entire politics a very zero-sum feel. Before I worked in venture capital, I worked in the law firm world, and one of the things that's happening in the legal world right now is that because the broader economy isn't growing, law firms themselves aren't really growing, and so you have this dynamic of very ambitious associates who are trying to get ahead in their law firms, but the partners aren't retiring and the firms aren't growing enough to actually promote them. And so you have these very sociopathic law firms where people know they're not going to get promoted. They bust their rear end even harder going after that one promotion opportunity that may eventually arise. And at the end of the day, many of them are left without real employment prospects, without the partnership that they so desired, and a feeling that despite working very hard, their labor and their work wasn't really rewarded. There are all kinds of ways in which stagnant institutions and stagnant growth infect our broader society. So I'm going to shut up in just a couple of minutes, but I want to sort of leave us on hopefully not a too pessimistic note. But I do think that there's something very deeply wrong. And what gives me some optimism is that as unstable and as chaotic as our politics sometimes feel, we're at least expanding the Overton window a little bit. I think it was Piers who talked a little bit about Darrick's work on baby bonds. I think the idea of a baby bond in late 1990s of America would have seemed a little too absurd. People wouldn't have bought it. It's too radical. It's too extreme. There are a lot of ideas out there, some of them terrible, but some of them very good, that are starting to enter the mainstream conversation because we recognize that the debate has gotten too stagnant, that the things we're allowed to talk about in public policy are too narrow, and consequently, I do think that there's some hope that, the people in this room, your generation, to use an overused term, is actually in a position to start solving some of the problems in the American dream. I hope so, because I think the alternative, long-term stagnation, is something this country has never experimented with. And if you look at history, the last time that I think we had this significant of a disruption in the labor market was in the early 20th century. And basically, with the exception of the UK and the US, nobody really made it through successfully. You had the communists taking over in certain parts of Europe. You had the fascists taking over in other parts of Europe. We as people, as civilizations, aren't good at the combination of stagnation and institutional decay. So we've got to figure out one of those things. Hopefully we'll figure out both of them. And at least, while I'm not going to sit up here and provide any answers, I think we're at least at a time in our public discourse where we can start to formulate those answers, because the Band-Aid has been ripped off and people recognize how serious the problem is. With that, I'll shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and now Professor Darrick Hamilton from the Kirwan Institute.
Okay, well, first, gratitude for you all coming on a rainy day, and thank you for the invitation, Kate, Eric, Piers, Gretchen, and JD. So my comments aren't meant to directly either compliment or refute what was just said, but inevitably there will be some contrast. For example, at the risk of oversimplifying, I wouldn't characterize the American despair that we have today as resulting from deficient values or scarcity. Rather, I would frame it as a problem. You know, I think the American economy is abundant. I think it's a problem of inequality and resource hoarding. In 2018, I delivered a TED Talk and began by stating that, quote, there's a narrative, an idea that resilience, grit, and personal responsibility, with those things, people can pull themselves up and achieve success. We call that the American dream. Our emergent American dogma radically situates the market as the great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic and otherwise. This political discourse is upheld by Democrats, Republicans, blacks, and whites alike. Basically, it goes that if black, brown, and poor people would simply reverse their self-sabotaging attitudes and behaviors and adopt the right attitudes and norms, full equality could be reached. Although it may seem like a distant memory, the transcendent election of Barack Obama provided the ideal symbolism and spokesperson for this political perspective. His rise to the highest office of the land became an allegory of hard work, merit, and personal responsibility. During his 2009 presidential address at the 100th anniversary celebration of the NAACP, the then president identified himself and the parenting behavior of his mother as examples of racial transcendence. Here's what he said, quote, I was raised by a single mom. I didn't come from a lot of wealth. I got into my share of trouble as a child. My life could have easily taken a turn for the worse. When I drive through Harlem or I drive through the south side of Chicago, I see young men on the corners. I say, there but for the grace of God go I. They're no less gifted to me. They're no less talented to me. But I had some breaks. That mother of mine, she gave me love, she pushed me, she cared about my education, she took no lip. She taught me right from wrong. Because of her, I had a chance to make the most of my abilities. So what is omitted from the Obama narrative? The fact that his mother had a PhD, and the fact that he received an elite education both abroad in Indonesia and domestically while on scholarship at one of the best high schools in Hawaii, private schools in Hawaii. Instead, he emphasized the love, motivation, and discipline that his mother instilled, which he presumes is lacking in the households of black inner city comparisons that he makes. In general, these cases of black exceptionalism are meant to serve as prima facie evidence of what individual and familial acts of perseverance and hard work can achieve. The problem with these convenient anecdotes is that they are tautological, and they lack the systematic use of a proper counterfactual to empirically validate or invalidate their conjecture. There's no accounting for the zero-sum nature of American social mobility system, nor the voluminous cases of Black Americans and other poor people who are exemplifying perseverance, grit, and hard work, but are not able to attain successful economic outcomes. Perhaps the greatest rhetorical victory of this neoliberal paradigm that we're in is convincing the masses that implicit in unfettered markets is the American dream. The opiate of hope that even if your lot in life is subpar, that with hard work, perseverance, and patience, you can turn your proverbial rags into riches. This neoliberal approach explains poverty and inequality as deficiencies internal to the poor and Blacks themselves. Stigmatization based on race and an anti-Blackness are strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks become the symbolism by which we define a surplus population. They're characterized as persistently unemployed and unemployable, a source of urban crime and malice, and whose subsistence needs become deemed a drain on fiscal budgets. This fuels the rationale for austerity policy. If behavioral modification, particularly with regards to personal and human capital investment, if that's the central issue, why fund government agencies and programs which at best misallocate resources to irresponsible individuals and at worst create dependencies to further fuel these irresponsible behaviors? We end up with state and local and federal interventions, as well as public-private partnerships that attempt to leverage private and charitable resources to manage and incentivize so-called defective Black, brown, and poor people to get an education and become more employable. What is glaringly missing from these narratives is the role of power and capital, and how power and capital can alter the rules and structure of transactions and markets in the first place. Power and capital, they are self-reinforcing, and without government intervention, they do what they do best. They iterate and concentrate. The promise of economic prosperity and relative racial progress of this neoliberal paradigm has never materialized. And worse, Blacks, along with government social programs, they're used as scapegoats to fuel this neoliberal agenda, despite the widespread growing inequality that we see. We use words like choice and freedom to describe the benefits of the market, but choice is an illusion. It is an illusion if an individual lacks basic needs like a job, adequate income, shelter, food, and health care. It is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. And the way in which wealth is created, it is wealth that begets more wealth. For the last 45 years, essentially all the economic gains from Americans' increasing productivity have gone to the elite and upper middle class. So prior to the early 1970s, productivity and real worker wages, they rose in lockstep, 1-to-1. After 1970, real wages flattened out, but American productivity continued to rise. This manifests in a concentration of wealth where the top 0.1% of earners, those earning above $1.5 million a year, own as much of the nation's wealth as the entire bottom 90%, while the bottom 50% of earners in America own about 1%. We would have to reach back to the greatest generation, a generation born nearly a century ago that entered adulthood around the time of the Great Depression, to find a generation with lower home ownership rates than young millennials face today. What's even more disheartening is that the racial gap in young adult home ownership is larger for millennials than any other generation since we've been recording it. America's obscene concentration and its accompanying plutocracy, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression, it's not natural, nor is it our destiny. For instance, the New Deal reined in unfettered capitalism and corporate consolidation and provided the nation with a balance of power that set a foundation for a strong labor movement and an unprecedented American middle class growth. President Franklin Roosevelt knew that, quote, necessitous men are not free men. That real freedom to pursue happiness required what he called the Second Bill of Rights, For Roosevelt, full citizenship demanded more than political rights. It required economic rights. And the first article of his second Bill of Economic Rights was the right to guaranteed employment. One's dignity is not limited to work, but everyone should have the right to work with the dignity of at least decent wages, benefits, and working conditions. Not only would a federal job guarantee restore psychological balance of the millions of unemployed individuals who desire to work but cannot, it would address America's long-standing unjust and discriminatory barriers that keep large segments of stigmatized populations out of the labor force and reverse the rising tide of inequality for all workers by strengthening their labor market bargaining power, by eliminating what tenured professors have, eliminating the threat of unemployment. This is in contrast to the free market revolution, which emphasizes deregulation, tax cuts, and tax incentives to cajole or bribe a private sector to provide more jobs under the lure that this is going to deliver an innovative, dynamic economy that's supposed to trickle down to all of us. It's critical to note that there was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy, and to a large extent, literally government giveaways or entitlement that provided whites with the finance, education, land, infrastructure in order to accumulate and pass down wealth. In contrast, by both design and implementation, blacks were largely excluded from the policies that created these wealth-generating benefits, and even when blacks were able to accumulate wealth, their land and enterprise was often stolen, destroyed, or seized by government-complicit theft, fraud, and terror. Our unjust racial wealth gap is rooted in a history from slavery to the Homestead Act to redlining and the more recent foreclosure crisis, in which whites have been privileged by political and economic interventions that afforded them resource and intergenerational accumulation, while blacks have been subjected to a history of exploitation and extrapolation of both their resources and their personhood. To achieve racial justice, we need an honest and sobering conversation of our historical racial sins. This authentic analysis would counter that neoliberal frame that characterizes black, brown, and poor people in general as undeserving, welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators. And instead, it would pave the way for narratives that more precisely frame inequality as grounded in resource deprivation. However, acknowledgement and apology alone would be empty if not accompanied by some form of redress. Reparations provides a retrospective, direct, and parsimonious approach to address the racial wealth gap. Moreover, it is a racially just policy because it requires the U.S. to take public responsibility and atone for its long history of racial injustice. A seed capital program like baby bonds is an economically and racially just prospective approach, since it targets a domain and outcome in which whites and blacks have very little overlap wealth. The permanent seed capital program would provide everyone with a capital foundation to build wealth and asset security in perpetuity, trend us towards a just and egalitarian distribution of both capital and wealth. But here's a key point. To fully understand the iterative concentration that we're in of economic and political power and why the status quo is able to persist, we need to embrace a third pillar in this relationship, and that is race, or more broadly, the existence of an underclass marked by some subaltern identity by which more dominant identity groups might be willing to trade off their vertical positioning in society in order to establish their horizontal positioning. In other words, relative status becomes more important to the dominant group with growing inequality. A white person can say, at least I'm not black, at least I'm not a Mexican, and unfortunately, we live in a paradigm where that has value. It's not hard to see this theory play out. In 2016 presidential election, that caught us off, many pundits and political scientists, off guard. But if we viewed this from the perspective of critical race theory, the results would have been less surprising. President Donald Trump's divisive appeal to whiteness was loud, boisterous, and it was clear. His campaign slogan of Making America Great Again, a fictional period in which white dominance was unchallenged and unquestioned, and his not-so-subtle dog whistle, that this one didn't get a lot of play, when he said, "I'm your last chance," with an overture to the pending demographic shift and when whites would no longer be a numerical majority. That was all about codifying the property rights in whiteness. Two things that are unambiguous from racial stratification is one, black workers are made worse off. Two, the capitalist class, which is overwhelmingly white, is made better off. What is ambiguous is the economic positioning of the white working class. And you know why it's ambiguous? Because white privilege offers psychological and material benefits. An authentic racial coalition to address our growing inequality would necessitate that the dominant white class give up the benefits of white privilege. And that's obviously not an easy ask. But this privilege is based on an amoral or immoral notion of benefit. And it's largely predicated on self-interested, neoliberal, and tribal norms in which accumulation knows no bounds. The good news is that change may be happening. Younger generations and social movements are beginning to redefine economic good to incorporate morality, sustainability, and common humanity. So we need a bold, transformative economic Bill of Rights that is consciously legislated and implemented in a racially inclusive way. Basically, we need race and gender conscious economic Bill of Rights. We need a government to use public power to assure that all people have access to the necessary resources to attain human dignity and self-determination. There's a set of essential good and enabling goods and services that are so critical for individual life, liberty, and self-determination that their quantity, their quality, and access to them should not be vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that come about from firms trying to meet their profit-maximizing fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. We need public entitlements. We need public entitlements that directly compete with and crowd out inferior private options that do not ensure universal and quality health care, housing, schooling, financial services, capital, and the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm because someone's identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. Rather than a government that emphasizes the market to sanction or discipline the choices of poor people, we need a government that provides competitive alternative that discipline exploitive practices of private entities and firms. Perhaps with the moral imperative of an economic rights frame, the divisive, base, and despotic political appeal to whiteness, which perpetuates inequality, perhaps then it would begin to lose its saliency. So in closing, we can reject the empirically unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance and so-called grit and personal responsibility are the sources of inequality, as well as the accompanying neoliberal paternalism in which government attempts to coerce and incentivize insinuated defective people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. Instead, we can change this paradigm. We can be bold, we can work at federal and local levels, we can go into progressive and conservative communities, and we can advocate for programs and initiatives that truly empower people with economic security, with dignity, and the agency to achieve their self-defined goals. And finally, have a long-term vision that's not caught up in the myopic neoliberal scarcity frame, which at the outset constrains all of us from reimagining the society that we might want and deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I could also invite Dean Ritter up to the stage for the next part of our session, which is going to be a moderated discussion with Dean Ritter and our two speakers. Thanks.
Is this on? Yes, please. So this is fun. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation. I want to also express my thanks to the Center for Ethics and Human Values, to the Kirwan Institute, to Honors and Scholars, and to the Minorities in Philosophy. And I want to say that this is exactly the kind of conversations we should be having at a university. It's exactly the kinds of conversations we should be having as American citizens, and so I'm really thrilled to be part of this. And I'm very excited to be part of this conversation and on stage with two people who make me think and who I find inspiring. These are both folks who are trying to make a difference in Ohio. These are both people who are concerned about economic opportunity. These are both people who are talking about dignity and morality and human security. They're both engaged, I think, in important ways in national conversations, and they're both thinking hard about what we can do to sustain a pathway to the middle class. So with that, let me ask you some questions. And I think my first question would be, do you see the American dream as a promise? And if so, what kind of promise is it? And both of you have talked about this a little bit already. And there are different ways, I would think, about framing it. We've talked a lot about framing it in terms of economic opportunity. But there are other ways, it strikes me, of framing a notion of the American dream. One that might draw from Martin Luther King or from the Declaration of Independence, that puts more of an emphasis on notions of dignity and equality and participation. One that also might have to do with the notion of civic culture and how sustaining inclusion in a civic culture is a critical part of believing that the next generation will do better. Do you believe in an American dream? And what is it? And do you think that this is a dream that is currently constrained?
Yes, I believe in an American dream. But, of course, there's a but. I believe that, it's hard to say co-opted because that would imply that it ever actually existed. I don't think it ever was put into fruition. I think it has largely remained an ideal or an idea. I mean, there are periods in American history where it became put into fruition for certain groups of Americans. But obviously, as a black man, it's hard for me to ever say that the American dream was ever really extended to black people in America. I'll say one other point, and that is the word opportunity in and of itself, I think, has become a political ruse. That opportunity is strategically used in a lot of ways to put the onus onto individuals. If we contrast opportunity with rights or entitlements, entitlements and rights obviously, well, not obvious, but because other people would argue they don't, but entitlement and rights, in my view, provide the agency and resources for people to do things with their life and make choices and be self-determinate. The word opportunity, I think, has become a political ruse that has been able to absolve the public of responsibility and put the agency on individuals. And we could probably get into a conversation of what education means. I think education certainly has some functional returns. We know that people with a college degree earn more, but I think those functional returns are exaggerated. I think they are exaggerated in comparison to the functional returns of resources to begin with. And it even becomes hard to disentangle what the resources to begin with produces independent of education. So one framing is to think of education. Gretchen, you brought up civic engagement. Well, education is important in its own right. We might want a citizenry that is highly educated, period, with no other need for justification, so that they can be able to synthesize information and turn it into big ideas. But I'm concerned that the rhetoric and the strategy of using education as a ruse, for the reasons I've described, is very central to the American dream.
Yeah, so my remarks were largely about the fact that I do believe in the American dream, but I do think it's constrained in important ways. I want to just mention there was a lot of Darrick's remarks that I agreed with, actually. Some things, of course, I did disagree with, but when he was talking, I was sort of thinking that maybe a better interlocutor would have been a libertarian, because the libertarians hate me, I think, more than they hate you. They always hate heretics more than they hate enemies. And I'm very much a heretic. But the thing that I really want to emphasize is that while the material components of the American dream and opportunity are very important, I do think we often, I think it was Schumpeter who talked about the way in which we measure material progress, we account for it, can sometimes distract us from the things that are very important that we're not measuring. And so, I think of female friends of mine who would really like to start a family but can't because it's either too expensive or because they have plenty of money, but the social and cultural pressures of leaving their job or even scaling back from the workforce are not something that they're willing to do right now. I know friends of mine who would really like to give up a job at Goldman Sachs, and if you measure it in economic terms, they're the winners. They're making a lot of money, they own property. They hate their jobs, and they hate the sense of striving. They hate the sense of pressure that they have to constantly consume more, earn more, climb higher up the economic ladder. I think that there's something really broken in our society right now where we measure things in such material terms that we've lost the ability to think about the ways in which economic opportunity and the non-material things can actually conflict. They're not just always, sometimes they're aligned and sometimes they're important, but sometimes they actually do conflict. An old professor of mine just came out with a book a few months ago called The Meritocratic Trap. It's by Dan Markovitz. It's very interesting, but he talks about this way in which this treadmill that, frankly, all of you are on in some form or another, especially the sort of under 25s in the audience, this treadmill to achieve in worldly material terms leaves people feeling hollow even when they're ultimately successful. And I do think that's the piece of it, where maybe Darrick and I just disagree, but if we're only measuring it by money or economic opportunity, we're missing this way that folks are just a lot less happy, I think, than they otherwise could be.
Can I jump real quick?
Sure, please.
So just a little bit of clarity. I got to hold it closer to my face, sorry. A little bit of clarification on how I see material things. I kind of agree with you that thinking about material things as an outcome is somewhat problematic and exaggerated. That is not the way I'm conceiving of material things. I'm conceiving of material things in a different way in that the agency that it might provide for you to do things as it relates to your life, to authentically have choice. And we could define it in terms of assets more broadly. And those assets in the American context has historically been individually based. But more broadly, we could talk about community assets as well. The idea of having material things to afford you the ability to see a doctor when you want to see a doctor, to get a quality education, to have a home, etc. We can do that in a public way or we could do it in a private way, but the agency and the functional role of material things is what's important.
I want to ask you both about morality and the marketplace. So it seems to me that each of you has been involved in work that might be seen as raising questions about the morality of the marketplace. So Darrick, you talk about geography, about race, about opportunity, and you do a lot to frame the importance of government regulation to having a marketplace that is more moral. And JD, you also talk about failures in various ways of the marketplace. You talk about the erosion of labor unions. You talk about college debt. You've been talking about and addressing the opioid crisis, and of course one can't help but think about the role of corporations in that. So I guess I would ask you, Darrick, whether or not the marketplace can be moral, and I'd ask you, JD, can the marketplace be immoral?
Clever question.
I tried.
You want me to lead again?
Sure,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right. My discipline has pulled a roost on everybody as well. I'd say this notion of the market as being somehow natural, somehow inevitable. Markets are political constructions. So the question of can markets be moral? Well, we can choose for them to be moral or not, right? It is this thing that somehow individual agents come together with self-interested motives and engage in transaction, and that's how markets work. I don't know any market that works that way. People point to farmers markets. I don't even think farmers markets work that way. You got to get a permit. You got to, right? I think there are children in the room, so I can't say, not children, young adults, so I can't say BS, but I guess I just did. So, that's my take on it. I think we can make choices and make decisions. For example, if we ensure that we might say, I'm happy with deregulation if we have public banks. So if we want to go to deregulate Wall Street, if the government came in with public banks to ensure that the most vulnerable in society have access to liquidity and aren't so exposed to predation from private entity, and you thought the deregulation allows them to innovate, I'm okay with that type of market. I think I'm okay with that type of market. I'd have to see the details, but that's an example. I want to say one thing about labor unions really quick is we can't ignore the role of race when we think about labor unions. To me, it's not a coincidence that labor unions today are proportionally predominantly black, and their power in general has weakened dramatically. To me, it's not a coincidence that states where we have large shares of black people are states that have the harshest right to union type legal infrastructure. It's not a coincidence that in the heyday of unions, blacks were largely excluded. So this is my point about right now, the ways in which capital is able to capitulate the dominant groups in society is to enforce relative status. I think that ultimately, if we're ever going to get beyond that system, we really got to have a more moral economy that emphasizes values like common humanity.
So yeah, this question of whether the market can be moral, immoral, how much it's shaped by public policy is sort of very interesting to me, so I'll try not to get too much in the clouds. I mean, one thing I'll say just directly in response to what Darrick said is, as much as we can blame various legislative changes and their effect on labor unions, I think the evidence at this point is very overwhelming that the biggest reason the labor unions started to decline in the late 1960s and the early 1970s is globalization, primarily labor arbitrage through offshoring. And as much as I know, I can tell Darrick, really dislikes the president, and there's certainly critical things that I would say. At the end of the day, there are two candidates, two mainstream politicians in America who have been making a sustained critique of globalization in the past decade. One is Bernie Sanders, and the other is Donald Trump. They're the only two. I think that's important, especially when we talk about the decline of unions. And this question of whether the market can be immoral. I'll illustrate this with, by making a point that got me in some hot water in the world that I work in technology investing. And if you live in Silicon Valley or you go to Silicon Valley, there's this exit off of Highway 101, Willow Road. And that's the highway, or that's the exit you take if you want to go to Facebook's global headquarters in Menlo Park. And as you're going to Facebook's headquarters, you'll pass a bunch of biotechnology companies, and those biotechnology companies are, trying to cure Alzheimer's. They're trying to cure cancer. They're developing therapies. They're going to make everybody's lives better, or at least some people's lives better. And if you're a neuroscientist working at Facebook, you make way, way, way more money than you do as a neuroscientist trying to cure Alzheimer's at one of those biotechnology companies. And to Darrick's point, that is a function of the way that our public policy has decided to create incentives for various people in various professions. And my view is that we shouldn't be politically agnostic to the fact that if we want more people curing Alzheimer's, we should be willing to say, as a matter of public direction, the people curing Alzheimer's should make more money than the people who are developing applications that sexual predators use to attack your children. But that is the difference between the tech economy in an IT sense and the tech economy that I care about, which is, in the world where people's real lives get better. And the final point that I'll make on this is, I'm sure that I'm sort of more to the right than Darrick on questions of economics. I do think that the market is good at pricing things. It's very good at deriving and creating pricing signals when people are buying and trading without encumbrance. And I do think it's valuable to be able to buy and sell the things that you want to be able to buy and sell, though obviously, there are a lot of qualifications that I'd make to that point. All that said, I agree with Darrick, and again, this is why I almost wish that I was watching a libertarian up here debate Darrick, that our public policy creates our markets. And frankly, our markets create our public policy. We know that corporate actors can influence the direction of public policy in important and powerful ways. So I think the market can be immoral, but I think the way that I would put it is that we can be immoral if we choose not to accept that we do actually have influence over these things.
Both of you have noted that we're in a difficult time, right? Both of you have pointed out that this is a moment in our society where we're dealing with really high levels of social division and social polarization. We've talked about it in terms of class. We've talked about it in terms of race. It's something certainly that I think about all the time, and one of the ways that I worry about it is our sort of lost ability to imagine a common future, and why believing in a common future, believing in a sum society, if you will, is necessary to be able to come together to solve some of the problems that we're contending with. So I guess I'd ask each of you, how do we create a sense of a common future again?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I do think it's a very important question. I do think that, to take a topic that Darrick played around with a lot, there is a sort of neoliberal consensus that polarization and division in our society is primarily a consequence of the news media, of the fact that people are just haven't figured out how to talk to each other well, and if we could just sort of get together and hold hands and talk to each other, everything would be fine. And I don't mean to disparage the importance of talking to each other, but I think these divisions come from the fact that for 30 or 40 years, a lot of people have had this deep sense that things are getting worse, and the Overton window for what you could actually talk about was very narrow. I think that the polarization in our society, in other words, comes from the fact that a lot of conversations that need to have been had over the past few decades are finally actually being had. And our history suggests that you look at one of the great pieces of American legislative progress, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I don't think people realize that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed by a Congress that I may have the number off by a couple of points, but I believe was 89% veteran. So one way of creating unity is to go and fight a gigantic world war, and then all the people come back and pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act because they feel like they're part of the same team. Right. The problem, of course, is that you have to fight a world war.
Part, yeah.
And I think that's not what any of us would want. And I don't know what we can do to create that same sense of national purpose without some external enemy. That's what did it in 1945, and we're not that good. I think we're not that good at feeling like we have that common purpose absent some external shock, and I don't know what that's going to be.
So let me just press you on that for a second, if I could. What about some of the proposals for service and tying service to opportunities in education, for instance?
I'm supportive of a national service program. It's become one of these things that I've probably become too preoccupied with the past couple of years. My friend Michael Lind, who is a political scientist in University of Texas at Austin, always tells me, though, that it's the best idea that has no chance of ever happening. So we'll see if it's actually viable.
So I want to go back a little bit to the other question that was raised, because the Sanders campaign would be very disappointed with me if I let it go that Trump and Sanders are aligned when it comes to trade. I'll say that globalization is certainly has many dimensions, but I think the Sanders approach when it comes to trade is one of thinking about worker rights more broadly, not even just in the United States, and thinking about competition in an international perspective on more fair terms. In fact, if we're going to have a moral society in America, it almost inevitably would have to spill over to the rest of the world. Moral values are not compromised. So if you believe in human dignity for Americans, I think if you really adopt that frame, inevitably it would have to include what it means to be a worker in China or a worker somewhere else as well. So I just want to make that point, and it's related to the other question that you raised, which is, I'm optimistic. I think younger generations are now starting to adopt the values that we need to have a holistic economy that overcomes some of the barriers we've had in the past. I'm thinking of Me Too. I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter. I'm thinking of the protest against climate change, where they're not caught up the way my generation was. I think JD's a little younger than me, but seduced by Reaganomics of notion that if I simply work hard and study hard, that I will have a pathway towards success, and that those, in my case, other black people that don't go to the Ivy League school and don't do these things, well, it's because they're not motivated enough. I think younger generations are seeing that, nope, that's a problem, it's not accurate, and they are less willing to compromise notions of justice just for the sake of justice and not be cannibalized. So that's my hope. And I also think that we've had dynamic leaders in the past that have emphasized the values of morality, common humanity, and sustainability. These are not pie-in-the-sky ideals. These are real things that are human, and I think people can grab a hold to. I think the wool over our eyes is this thing that humans inevitably are going to be self-interested and selfish and can't see our common humanities. I think the clergy community, if we look at leaders like Reverend Barber, if we go back to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, when they start to get mass appeal is when they start appealing to those common values of humanity, morality, etc. So to me, that's the pathway forward.
I was struck that both of you ended on positive notes. Both of you talked about this being a moment of openness to new and bigger ideas, particularly seeing the generation that we're seeing out in this audience as being those willing to consider and put forward some of those ideas. I'd love to hear two things. One is, what are some of the big ideas that you're especially excited about? And are there any big ideas that you could imagine working together on?
You want a federal job guarantee? Can we do that? You with me?
I won't say no, but I'm not going to say yes either on that. I haven't thought enough about the federal job guarantee. I mean, I'll just take a couple of ideas that have come up from sort of the right of center universe that I think even 5 years ago it would have just been absurd to imagine this. So one is from my friend Orrin Cass, who's a think tank fellow and fellow sort of heretic on a lot of these things. And Orrin is argued pretty persuasively that if you look at why unions work in Europe, especially in East Asia, and if you look at how they function structurally in the United States, are just very different. In other words, the Western European model of labor has sort of evolved institutionally, whereas in a lot of ways the American model of labor is still sort of trapped in the 1920s or the 1930s. And so he's proposed a whole host of reforms to effectively update American labor laws in such a way that maybe corporations would be less antagonistic towards them, but certainly they would be more viable in a modern 21st century hyper-globalized economy. So that's one idea that I'm a big fan of. I mean, the second idea that I've become pretty fascinated with is this idea that we should actually learn something from the Chinese economic model of the past 20 or 30 years ago. And to this point about the market being independent of our laws and our regulations and so forth, One of the things that Chinese have done quite successfully is say, we want to become a world leader in gene therapy. We want to become a world leader in advanced manufacturing. And I think there are a lot of sectors. Maybe clean energy is one where we could get on board. Though I think Darrick would probably be on my side on a lot of the labor stuff. But there are a lot of ways, and this is, I'd point people to Sam Hammond, who's a fellow at the Niskanen Center, who's written about how America has to have a more directed technology policy. One of the few areas where I just have a disagreement of fact is about this question of productivity. I think productivity has been really stagnant since about the mid-1970s, basically since the oil shock during the end of the Reagan administration, the beginning of the Carter administration, the end of the Nixon and Ford, and sort of beginning of the Carter administrations. And I really think that no matter how much you figure out the apportionment question, the distributive question, that if you don't have real productivity growth, we're in sort of a boom economy. People are calling this, fastest sustained productivity growth for a decade in a very long time. We're not growing anything like we did in the 50s, 60s, and so forth. And we're at the tail end of a boom. If you look at it over a 30 or 40-year period, we're growing at 1% to 2% a year, averaged out. You cannot solve our distributive problems without creating a lot of social conflict unless you get those productivity numbers up. And I think to do that, you have to make America a leader like it used to be in high technology sectors. So those two things I'm pretty optimistic about. Again, either of those ideas, both of them came from the right. Either of them would have been considered completely out of the question during a Mitt Romney presidential campaign.
I guess some things to note, and I guess here we're starting to see some clear distinctions. I guess there are others, but I certainly don't think we have a scarcity problem or even an American productivity problem. I'd say that dating back to the 50s and 60s, in addition to some of the innovation that might have been taking place, we also had the New Deal and post-war policies that were taking place, and we were coming out of World War II. But at least since the 1970s, early 1970s, American productivity has been growing a great deal. Output per worker is way up. What is problematic is real wages have been stagnant since that point. Economic Policy Institute, they have a graph that they call productivity pay gap graph, where they demonstrably show this. It's known as the clam graph, where productivity and real worker wages lockstep, and then you just get this dispersion. So I think that in general, the scarcity frame has constrained us in a lot of ways from doing big things. And take, for example, that last Trump tax cut, which was, $2.3 trillion over the next decade when he passed it. That's not going to destroy the American economy. It's going to lead to more hoarding and concentration at the top and more plutocracy, where those with a lot of wealth will be able to structure the rules in their favor. But the American economy, as measured by GDP per capita growth, is not going to be destroyed by that huge deficit ballooning policy that he put forth. So that deficit framing that we have, pay-go, those are all things that are constraining us. The American public power is immense, and it's particularly immense when it's being used towards investing in our greatest resource, which is us, its people. That's not going to inflate the economy. That's going to lead to productivity gains that will stimulate the economy and actually grow the economy. I think we have historical precedent to suggest that that's true. So if I'm thinking about big ideals, another problem with scarcity frame, I'll give you a quick story, and I know we might be running short on time. I presented baby bonds, and then people respond, well, what about early childhood? You're talking about wealth when the child becomes an adult. And my answer is, what about early childhood? That's important as well. So we can have a package of goods. There is no silver bullet policy that's going to solve our problems. But there are a set of problems, a set of goods and services that we can define. We could talk about the right to income, the right to a job, the right to health care, the right to education, the right to finance, the right to a credit score that's not proprietary to a private entity, but has transparency through public credit scoring or some other mechanism. We can think about a package of goods that people need in order to thrive and be self-determining. So that's what I'm talking about, and that scarcity frame that says that we can't pay for it, I think there's ample evidence to suggest yes, we can, and frankly, we already are paying for it. The question is where we're spending that money, on a huge military and towards hoarding wealth to those at the top. But we don't even need pay-go. The American monetary system would allow us to pay for the things that we want.
I think I'm going to open it up to a couple of questions from the audience at this point. We've got a microphone here in the middle. If you'd like to ask a question, could you please come to the mic and just say who you are before you ask your question? And then one other bit of instruction. Please make it a question. Hi there.
Hi, I'm Ronnie Etchison. I'm an undergraduate studying data analytics and econ. First of all, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate what you have to say. My question is for Mr. Vance. So I work for the Battelle Center for Science and Policy, so I was really interested in what you had to say about technology policy. Whoops. I work for the Battelle Center for Science and Public Policy, so I was really interested in what you had to say about technology policy. How do you recommend, I noticed that you started a new venture capital firm in Cincinnati. How do you recommend that we help spread the growth beyond just the superstar cities on the coasts to the rest of America?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think a lot of it is just access to capital. I mean, still to this day, one of the things we don't talk enough about is that one of the core implications of the 2008-2009 financial crisis is that small business financing in primarily black neighborhoods in this country just disappeared. I mean, it was a massive, massive capital gap. You need capital to do things. You need capital to actually run companies, especially companies that aren't yet making a profit. And if you look at where the risk capital, meaning the capital that you don't have to pay back if you're an entrepreneur, which allows you to sort of really go off and do big things, it's almost all concentrated in San Francisco, New York, and Massachusetts. That's a very bad thing. So I think one of the solutions is you have to get more risk capital outside of those three big mega cities. And related to this question about scarcity, and I want to make sure folks aren't confusing my point. My point is not that we can't afford things because of deficit financing. We are the world's reserve currency, and so long as we're the world's reserve currency, frankly, we shouldn't care that much about the deficit. All of the indicators, bond markets, interest rates suggest that we shouldn't care as much about that. But there's a difference between scarcity when it comes to deficit financing and real sustained growth. I mean the type of growth that allowed Henry Ford and Ford Motor to employ a ton of people at $5 a day and, oh, by the way, create a product that was very useful for people. If you look at the broad advanced economies in the world, there is so little real growth happening. We can go back and forth on how much growth has stagnated. I think what is uncontroversial is that growth in the post-1970s America was lower than it was from 55 to 75. Just measure 55 to 75 and then 75 to 2015. No comparison. But importantly, a lot of that growth was just fake. If you look at basically on a decade-by-decade trajectory, 1970s, really bad decade for growth. 1980s, really good decade. 1990s, really good decade. The 2000s, of course, because of the financial crisis, really bad decade. What's going on in our economy is financialization. You have a lot of people. There was a really good study that came out right after the financial crisis that showed that basically all of the real wage gains were going to the financial sector. You cannot run a successful economy when you get more return from moving money from one place to another than by investing in drugs that are going to save people's lives. So I think there's a different question from scarcity economics and real growth that isn't just built basically upon moving money from New York to Beijing to London to Paris and back again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi there.
Hello, my name is Joey. I'm also an undergrad here. My question is for both of you. You mentioned a lot about how much things have gotten worse, especially for workers, starting in probably around the mid-1970s going until now. And it seems to me when I listen, the two things that I think of over that period of time that were monumental for that were deregulation and the financial crisis. My question then is, to what extent are the struggles that we see now the result of those two things, like our response to the financial crisis, our widespread deregulation, the influx of Reaganomics? Is it the lack of government action after the crisis, beforehand? And what should we do about that now? Is there time to fix it?
Do you want me to go first, Eric? Or? Yeah. So, I mean, I think deregulation, there are multiple different kinds of deregulation, right? So there's airline deregulation that happened in the mid-1970s. I think you can make a good argument that that actually made airplane tickets cheaper. There are more flights. Inflation-adjusted terms, it's cheaper to buy a plane ticket today than it was in the mid-1970s. There's also financial deregulation, which happened primarily in sort of the early to mid-90s, and of course, its bills came due in the late 2000s. I tend to think that deregulation is a bit of a red herring in the sense that I don't think it was either really good or really bad in most cases. I think that the financial crisis was primarily a function of financialization, which again it comes from the fact that there were a lot of incentives to move money from one place to the other. Deregulation may have allowed more sophisticated financial instruments to come online. In fact, it probably did. May have exacerbated the crisis. I think the fundamental problem, though, is that you had a bunch of people with a lot of capital moving it from point A to point B and had no idea how to actually spend it. I know I'm a broken record on this, but real growth is different from just moving money from one place to the next. And I think the financial crisis was largely that a lot of people saw they had been betting, and the financial crisis was not primarily a creation of any one instrument. It was a creation of bankers saying that housing prices are going to keep going up and up and up and up. If housing prices kept on going at 2 to 3%, probably isn't a financial crisis. So again, I think it's hard to disconnect a lot of what's going on from the fact that we've basically been living in a society, to my point earlier, with declining institutions on the one hand and fake growth on the other. But I'll shut up, let Darrick answer.
There's a great book by Akerlof and Schiller called Fishing for Fools. And one of the points that they make in the book is that, and this is true since the beginning of, I guess, recorded history, that the financial industry has an incentive to try to exploit and extract from consumers, to take resources for themselves. That is, finance industries do other things as well, like provide liquidity and credit, but that is their motivation. That is a profit model. That is, I think, what JD is talking about as well. So the arbitrage and trying to extract from people is what the finance industry does. So deregulation created an environment that created, that was permissive of lack of consumer protection, innovation of new processes and products that were better able to extract and exploit, and also greater risk-taking activity in the search of myopic short-term profit. So deregulation did expose our economy to the collapse that happened. So I think that it is, but a couple of things. One is all those things happened, but this is in part the nature of capital and the finance industry, and I believe we know this. So I think if we want a long-standing program to address it, it can be attacked in a couple of ways. One, with regulation. Although you have this game where you have regulation in one period, the next period the finance industry will invest a lot to try to figure out ways to get around that regulation. So it's a cat and mouse game that will go on in perpetuity. But alternatively, the government can also be more proactive and active. And that's why, in my view, public banking can provide alternatives to make sure that, one, if the cowboys on Wall Street want to engage in malfeasance or high risk-taking activity, we're not vulnerable to that moral hazard where we have to bail them out. That if indeed they get themselves into trouble, they can go out of business. The vulnerability is that if they go out of business, the rest of America is not protected. So if the public sector is more actively engaged in ensuring that there is some direct protection to consumers throughout a host of domains, as well as some regulation, I think that becomes the approach we should take.
Can I just add one more comment on that? Because you said you're an economics major. Is that? Okay, so just one point on that is that I think we tend to understate how much capital, maybe less now than 5 years ago, but certainly over the past 20 or 30 years, how much capital has been going into quote unquote consolidation, sort of funding mergers, cost cutting, i.e. laying a lot of people off or offshoring or outsourcing a lot of things. To the extent that you're ever involved in the investment of capital, I think it's much better for the soul to be investing in things that grow and that hire people as opposed to shrink and fire people. So just, 1 point to the business folks in the audience.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm a religion major, so I don't really have a
Okay.
question for you. My question is primarily for Darrick, but you can wait if you'd like. So a lot in your talk, you talked a lot about how African Americans were excluded from economic benefits and how white people had it. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on the 1619 project, and if you could weigh in on that, if you agree or disagree, just talk about it.
We should get Nicole Hannah-Jones to come to campus, because I think, there we go. Yeah. And matter of fact, Kerwin should figure out a way to help do that.
There we go.
But I think the project is brilliant. I think it is consistent with what I'm talking about in terms of that sobering, honest conversation about what took place. I think that, the idea of reparations, if not in this political moment, at some point it might occur. But I ultimately do think that that is what America's gonna have to do if we ever are gonna get beyond the race problem. I think that in the interim, there as I've been talking about, universal race-conscious programs that both by design and implementation, we ensure that we don't leave people behind, that we can do to make things better. But ultimately, recognizing that past and that history and redressing it is where we have to go to have your religion major, a better soul as a country.
Thank you.
And I think we have a last question.
Hello, thank you both for being here. I am a graduate student in the theater department here at Ohio State. A few members of my cohort are here. And this year we are writing a production on the opioid crisis in Ohio. So I'm glad that both of you are here. This is really for both of you. If either of you have an answer, that would be great. I'm just wondering where you think we should look in terms of research and what kinds of stories have not been told that should be told, specifically about the crisis here in Ohio.
I'll try to answer briefly just to give Darrick some time to answer as well. I think the story, and this is maybe very self-interested of me to say, but the story that I still think hasn't been told enough is of the grandparents who are actually picking up so much of the slack, and this is happening a lot, of course, in the black community, also in the white community. The thing that is preventing this from becoming a full-scale, just social dissolution is the fact that you have a lot of grandparents who are taking care of kids who've been orphaned, either because the kids, meaning the parents of the children, the son or daughter of the grandparents, they're dead, they're in jail, they're otherwise incapacitated, and I would love to see more stories told about that, because I think it's both true, it gives people some sense that they're being heard, but it also is, at the end of the day, I think pretty uplifting when you have, 68, 75-year-old people who don't actually legally owe an obligation to a kid, going way above and beyond to make sure that they don't totally slip through the cracks.
So there's the work of Angus Deaton and Ann Case called Deaths of Despair, which is making the point that a demographic of whites, and Ohio's one of the communities that they look at, had the perverse outcome where mortality rates started to rise. And they found that it was rising in what they're calling illnesses of despair. I might be butchering what they call it, but things like suicide, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, et cetera. And obviously, with the word despair, they're linking it to economic condition. So there's work that I've recently done with Arjaman Siddiqui, Tressie McMillan-Cottom, and William Darity, where we argue that perhaps they should think about it in terms of perceived relative status. That if, again, I've been talking a lot about relative status, So it's not just only absolute status that is causing perhaps some of this despair. And you might ask, well, why isn't that mortality phenomena happening with black people? Well, black people have been used to struggle for a very long time. So to the extent that there's a shock to despair, it might be baked in. Unfortunately, this is not a good story. So when people talk about resiliency, that's a horrible, tragic story if we're characterizing a population as being resilient because they're used to despair and on a permanent basis. But that being said, the paper tries to make the point that perhaps it's perceived relative status of white people that's leading to some of these mortality increases as well. That, with Trump, I think, pounced upon, which is, I'm going to codify the property rights and whiteness again to restore your rightful place on this hierarchy. So I'm saying all of that to say that ultimately, again, a lot of the stuff that I think I've been talking about, which is if we address that despair and address it in an inclusive way, I think that can mitigate a lot of the social harms that we see. I think that opioid use is a product of economic despair. So addressing the root cause will lead to even things that you might see as family values or whatever. By the way, I'm okay with new types of family arrangements that emerge over time. I mean, the fact that we have less married households, we knew that at some point in the 1950s, being a single woman was basically destiny for poverty. So the fact that women can go in the labor force and have greater agency to choose a divorce, I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. But nonetheless, with properly resourced individuals, I think that they can really make choices and have positive social outcomes, no matter what it is that we're looking at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. You've given us a lot to think about and chew on, and this has been a great conversation. Thanks to our audience as well.
Thank you.